Welcome to mini lecture number 8 in 7503 NSE Aviation Economics. This one we're dealing with air cargo, so we're away from passengers. And of course air cargo is something that is a reality of life. We've all sent packages by air, we've received packages from air, and the one thing that we find is that air cargo is a fascinating area of economics within itself. So what are we going to be doing here? Well, first of all, we're going to be looking at the historical development of air cargo services because the history has really affected it more than people think. For example, the first airline aircraft didn't make money out of passengers, they made it out of carrying mail. And even today, cargo still makes up a big part of every passenger flight. We're going to be describing the forces, technologies and constraints impacting air cargo growth. And this is going to be an important one because whilst the technology has really improved, generally what we know is cargo aircraft are generally passenger aircraft that have been converted purely because of their age to carry cargo, because they're cheaply available. We're going to be describing the role of the air freight forwarders and the three types of air cargo carrier. That is, there are specialised people out there who just earn their money out of air freight alone. We're going to contrast the current and future air cargo passenger transport roles with other transport options, and of course air cargo obviously competes with sea and in some cases can never hope to compete in certain areas, but in other areas it can compete very, very well based on its own special attributes. We're going to be discussing the air freight market itself and the types of commodities that are best suited for it, and we're going to talk about some of the specialised air freight services and the rates and the factors impacting them, and we're going to identify world air cargo developments and trends. Air cargo is one of these things that just seems to keep rolling on. It has a very steady rate of growth, but it doesn't seem to do anything well outside expectations. And we'll be looking at one of the reasons why. First of all, we said it's pretty important to understand the history, because one of the things is that the history of air freight development has basically passed on to some of the things that are still occurring today. That is, some of the traditions are very, very strong in the air freight market. The big difference is, of course, air freight in its early history earned far more than passenger services. And in fact, they really made it possible to set up the airlines simply because of the subsidies that airlines got in the early days in carrying mail. Well, of course, that's now changed. But the one thing is that there is a historical belief with the airlines that freight is not a great money earner, and today it's still less than about 3% of airline revenues. And the one thing is that when we look at it, the world maritime industry in 2011 carried 8.8 billion tonnes of freight compared to 43 million tonnes for the air cargo industry. So air cargo obviously does a role, but a very, very specialised role, because there are some things it can never hope to compete with sea transport on. If we look at the world air cargo market, we'll study graphs and we'll take a look at exactly what's happened on the actual air freight side. We can see that the revenue tonne kilometres has basically continued climbing at a fairly good rate over the years, but what we can see is that it is pretty much still a fairly steady rate in staying well within certain constraints. So if we look at the annual cargo rate and the revenue tonne kilometres, we can see that there's been a steady rise, and the predictions from the International Air Transport Association are that will continue to go. We can see the forecast indicators, and these also tell us as to just where freight is going to be going for the future. So we can see that there is investment that is going to occur in this field, but what we find is that the trends will still tend to stay pretty much what we think they are for the future. And we'll be looking at a number of different graphs to be able to track exactly where air freight has come from, how it's performing today, and what the predictions are for the future. We'll look at the different types of freight carriers, and we get the integrated carriers. These are the FedExes, the United Parcel Services, DHL. These are people who are set up to carry freight from door to door. That is, they'll pick it up from your home and they'll take it and process it through and then put it on an aircraft, move that aircraft across the world if need be, and they'll deliver it to the door at the other end. This requires a fair amount of infrastructure to set up. We'll look at the combination carriers, and these are the ones who carry passengers and cargo. And what we'll be finding out is, of course, that about 50% of air freight still actually travels on board passenger aircraft. Then we'll look at the all-cargo airline. These are airlines that are set up purely to carry air cargo, and this is very specialised air cargo. For example, large pieces for drilling rigs, etc., where a piece is required because a drill rig at sea that's costing you something like about $1 million a day to operate, you can't afford to have it down and out of service simply because of a spare part. And petroleum companies, as is other companies, can't afford downtime, and they'll pay the special rates. We'll take a look at the air cargo fleet growth, and we'll see that the global freighter fleet has increased about 80% over the, it's going to increase 80% over the next 20 years. But what we will see is that, in fact, there is a move towards the larger wide-bodied aircraft, and also we'll see that, in fact, a lot of the aircraft coming online will still be converted passenger aircraft. So we'll be taking a look at these trends and seeing, well, how does this affect the economics of cargo carrying? That is, if you are actually using older converted aircraft, these are going to be the aircraft that are not going to be so fuel efficient. So why, in fact, do people use them? And we'll see there are very strong economics. We'll look at the different air freight rates, and we'll see that, for example, it's the old story. You get what you pay for. And if you want something that's really important, then you'll pay a special high rate. For speed package service, where you've got economies of scale, you will pay a much cheaper rate for that sort of use. And then, of course, we've seen, just as with shipping at sea, the container has transformed that. The container, of course, is used also on board freight aircraft, where we can empty aircraft very, very quickly at one end, refill them with new containers, and make sure that that aircraft, like a passenger aircraft, is not wasting time on the ground, it's in the air earning money. We'll take a look at some of the devices that are used in the container world, and we'll take a look, as you can see in this picture, at the different sorts of containers and their specialised role, and how, in fact, the distribution centres used by the specialised carriers are used to fill containers so that everything gets on board the aircraft quickly, off the aircraft quickly, and then the distribution centre has special computerised sorting to make sure that the packages move quickly to their destination. We'll look at some of the factors affecting air freight rates, such as what does it cost to put the service on? What are the economies of scale from volume? What about directionality? For example, an aircraft may be flying in one direction, full of high priority parcels, but when it comes back it could be returning empty. So in fact, that's the reason why you may often go to a florist and find that the flowers that you're buying may have come from halfway across the world, and yet they compete on the same price as the local flowers. Why is that so? Directionality's got a lot to do with it. Traffic characteristics, that is, freight density. Very often we find that certain packages might be small, but they weigh a lot. How do we fit this in? Value for service. For example, when we go with DHL, FedEx or UPS, we're paying for speed reliability. That is, you'll send a package and they'll continue to send you updates as to where that package is. You know exactly where it is. And finally, that last one, as with passengers. What is the competition doing? Are we doing the same? Do we have an edge on them? If they're doing something better, how can we do that as well? We'll look at aircraft themselves and we'll see. We spoke about the fact that very often our freighter aircraft are not often built purely for that role, but some are. Some aircraft go through the production line with the F designation, that is, they're built to be freighters, and they have certain characteristics in them straight away. Strengthened floors, for example, where we can raise the nose, as in the diagram here. We find that where it's a converted aircraft, we must make sure that the access doors can take all the different size containers, that the floor can take packages of a certain strength. And sometimes we get the Combi aircraft. This is an aircraft that can carry passengers but also freight, such as we see in the lower picture, where the aircraft can take freight up forward and passengers at the rear. These are all the things that cargo has to do to make sure it competes but also keeps its costs down. What are the trends? Well, we'll be going into this in a lot more detail, but the one thing is that we found that air freight has been really weakening over the past few years, but it's slowly picking its way up again. Freight yields have also stayed fairly steady, but the cost of operation is in fact increasing if we're using the older style aircraft. The one thing though, we said earlier, that carrying freight in the belly of a passenger aircraft, about 50% of our freight goes there. So we'll be seeing that airlines not only earn money just out of passengers, but also because so much freight being carried in the belly, that's a good money earner for them. But the one thing is that 75% of the world freighter fleet are old converted aircraft. And the big thing is, with cheap oil at the moment, this is really looking to be a good operation for the cargo carriers, but that's not going to stay the same. So again, what we'll be doing is studying as to how the market might move in the future. So in summary, we've looked at the historical development of cargo air services and how it's affected the cargo services today. Cargo is a part of air operations, but it's still not a major part as much as it was in the early days of aviation. We're going to be looking at the forces, the technologies and the constraints that impact air cargo growth. And we're going to be looking at the air freight forwarders and the special companies, DHL, UPS and FedEx, who have special infrastructure. And we'll be seeing just what their infrastructure really is that makes them such a potent force. We're going to be looking at the current trends and how the future's going in the market, and taking a look at how air freight carriers really work out the different rates they're going to charge and how they get the most out of their cargo compartments. We're going to be discussing the world air cargo developments and the trends for the future to show that cargo is still one of the potent forces in the airline economics world. Thank you.